Great. Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to another one of our kind of coaching meditation demonstrations, meditation coaching, excuse me, demonstrations. And today I'm with EricTroth. And Eric has quite an advanced practice. So it'll be interesting to see where this this session goes. But Eric, if it's okay with you, I'll just read the answers you gave on when you registered and then ask you to elaborate a little bit on your practice. Okay, so Eric says that Eric has a formal meditation practice, and he has studied with teachers, more than one teacher, I believe. And he's been practicing meditation in various forms for over 30 years. He did Vipassana perhaps for the first 15 years and has had exposure to various other methods since then. And for the last 7 years or so, Eric has been studying with Thomas Hubel. And he mostly does a simple practice of just sitting and presence meditation. His daily practice, Eric practices every day for 20 to 30 minutes. And sometimes he has the opportunity to set up to an hour. In terms of his retreat experience, Eric, a long time ago, was doing Vipassana. And he did a fair number of 5-day and 10-day retreats. He's also done a couple of weekend Zen retreats with Diane Hamilton. And in his training with Thomas Hubel, they had a 10-day retreat a couple of years ago, and that was one of his most recent. So there's quite a range of in a way, mindfulness practice, and which is a non-self path, and then non-dual practice as well. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit, Eric?
Yeah. I think, one of the things as I reflect on my history with meditation is, how much time I've spent practicing poorly in terms of misunderstanding instructions and doing things that were probably counterproductive.
Sure.
I think back to my early Vipassana days where I would, sit there committed to not moving for, the hour period or whatever, and I'd be in pain, and I'd be in this internal fight and so forth.
And that was without a meditation teacher?
I did have teachers, but there was sort of that strong-edged, maybe more masculine style sometimes that was coming through. I was doing stuff out of a couple of different groups. I guess I'll just let the name go for now. But part of it is my interpretation too, of course. I'm filtering everything. So we're want to add that qualifier at the beginning that anything I say about background that I have is always, of course, through my own filters of how I interpret the teacher's instructions through my own idiosyncratic things and shadow and all the rest. So I don't want to misinterpret. I don't want to misrepresent anybody else for my bad, right?
But also depending on the state that we're in, that we also have that creates a lens through which we interpret things, which comes also with our cultural lens. So that's another thing. And I wasn't necessarily interested in bad-mouthing any traditions, but when you said a more masculine style, a few different, including my background, Mahasi is very masculine. I know that the Goenka style is also very masculine. For people watching this, would you explain a little what you mean by masculine style?
Yeah, what do I mean by that? Yeah, it feels very willful and pushing through, like meeting resistance very actively, something's hurting and I refuse to move. I'm going to sit there and suck up the pain.
Yeah.
And, more relaxed, what I might call more feminine would be to, release that. Oh, you got to move a little bit? Okay, go ahead, shift your posture a little bit. That feels better. Okay, now I can relax and be present in a different way.
So bringing acceptance and somehow less self-judgment, less striving, less pushing yourself, less self-struggle, the struggles that we have.
Yeah, and I would say that's definitely more part of how I practice now in recent years compared to my earlier training. But I think also, what I'm looking for today, as I thought we'd explore together, is like how to, see where, what are maybe some little insights into things that I'm doing where I kind of get in my own way. And, I think a lot of times I practice poorly where I just sit, I go through the motions, but I'm distracted and really caught up in my story. And so what I'm looking at now is how do I rest in awareness that is always already present. It's not something
Yeah.
that I have to do to get there. That meditation is that field already exists, and it's me letting go of all my struggles and trying. And that's kind of an edge that I'm playing with right now, is to look, oh, I got caught up in my story. I've been away in my story for the last couple of minutes. Okay. Not any beating up or whatever, just noticing, but there's still this little bit of strive in there that's kind of like
Sure.
imagining, oh, I gotta try hard. Just gotta get the right. And it's paradoxical too, because in a way I realize it's like, wait, there's nothing I really need to do. It just is. It's there, and it's a matter of really listening and widening into that. So
Yeah. Ken Wilber says that a lot. He says when you're meditating, you'll never see anything like a stage of development. And in this case, I'm talking about stages for those who are integrally informed. There's stages, worldviews, but then there's also stages of practice. And you never really see that. You don't see a stage in practice. But looking back, you can say, oh yeah, I used to be caught up in this stuff, and then it went to this, and then you can kind of see a development over time in the practice. And I think what you were talking about before, with the masculine, we can choose to be on the masculine or the yang side of the spectrum, feminine, more yin side of the spectrum. Either way, it's fine. But either approach, there's actually nothing wrong with either approach. But the main thing about mindfulness or just present or just sitting is that it is not an active practice, nor is it a passive practice. It's right. It rests when we happen to align with that. It's right there in the middle, neither active and neither passive. And that mindfulness, that quality of mindfulness, is what it's the conditions that's necessary for the process just to start to unfold on its own, and then development evolution just happens in that state.
Yeah, and that's the place I'm really curious about, is that sweet spot in between the actively trying and not just passively, drifting off, that it requires an alertness, a certain quality of attention, but if that gets too far, then it interferes.
Exactly.
And then if I get too soft with it, then I can just sort of mush out and get, really caught up in the enjoyable stories or unenjoyable stories, as the case may be.
Yeah. And we can, like, how should I say this? I'm going to refer a little bit to Vipassana, but it kind of applies to everything. But just if you think of the hindrances, we could be caught up in desire about something, or fantasy, or we could be caught up in aversion. Oh, that person said this, and an old story, playing an old tape, even if it was 5 minutes ago. And usually our kind of egoic stand with those mental states, with challenging mental states or unskillful mental states, is either to indulge or deny, pretend that they're not there, or resist. And all three of those moves are kind of, they're kind of there's still agency in all of that. There is a subtle agency in indulging. And there's a subtle agency in of course, in struggling, and sometimes a lot of agency. And there's also a subtle agency, it's usually unconscious, but there's a subtle agency in denial that I'm fantasizing, or denial that that I have negative feelings about that person over there. So that subtle agency, and in the practice, the moment we notice that, what we have to do is we have to kind of shift from, let's say there's a strong desire or aversion or regret or some unskillful thought about something. We can be mindful of the thought and put a label on it, thinking, or planning, or regretting, or arguing, whatever's going on in the mind. Or if you get to a much more subtle level, you can just sit back and catch agency, or selfing, because it's all that kind of independent, separate sense of self that has a subtle agency. It's almost not even fair to say it's doing, because it's so subtle, it doesn't feel like doing, but it is a very, very subtle level of mental activity that's just not in that balanced place. So that's the tricky thing. And if you have something specific you want to ask about, that's great. Otherwise, I would ask about your practice and see what you're doing in those moments.
First of all, I appreciate in what you just said about the agency and the selfing. It's a different way of understanding it than maybe what I've been having before this. And so Yeah.
Again,
Just
that's
to take that in. And,
yeah, that's kind of a method or a little
mm-hmm.
trick technique from Vipassana. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say this for the recording because I think you understand this. Vipassana is really creating the observer, right?
Mm-hmm.
This perfect place that's neither active or passive
Mm-hmm.
is what we call the observer, but it's still a dualistic practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other practices which sounds like you're doing more these days, which is even relaxing the observer into more of a kind of a sense of being, kind of
Mm-hmm.
collapsing the
Mm-hmm.
self-other dichotomy. Either one is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Because both of those are actually free of agency.
Mm-hmm.
But then the agent does kind of arise out of that observer, especially if you have the observer, oh, I see the most subtle thing. And and your mind can get so sharp sometimes you can take an object and it just dissolves, disappear. Another thought comes up, it dissolves and disappear. And then but then the observer can be hiding behind that skill at some point. So at some point
Mm-hmm.
the practice has to really turn in to what's this selfing that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's useful for me because I look at, what I do now and like how do I, excuse me. So how do I give myself instructions, for instance, when I'm sitting there? So I sit down to meditate and, I notice certain things. So first there's a little bit of a settling in, really
Okay.
being with the body, with my breath. And then,
And sorry, just
yeah.
so the settling in, you use the body and the breath to kind of anchor you in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and then when the mind relaxes, and then you shift
Mm-hmm.
into something else.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, yeah, there's sort of ways of interjecting a little bit of, say, from big mind practice or, pointing out instructions where I'll
Right.
just notice, okay, feelings, sensations arise, thoughts arise. I'm not those things. And so it's kind of like a pointing out to myself of being the space in which all of this is arising. And there's that sense of a widening of, like, when I'm in my ideas or stories, there's kind of like a narrowing of focus, and I meditate with eyes closed, but I can feel it in my eyes. There's a subtle tension around there, and almost like if I were to exaggerate, it's like the focused brow and all that. And when I'm widening, to use that metaphor, it's kind of like into the peripheral. It's an expanding, wide, vast space that sees these things arising, but is not identifying with them. But how is it that I'm directing myself into that space? Because I see another potential little, trap in the way of doing that. Because I can, say, I'm the space in which, but then why do I need the eye? There's just that space. Why do I need to put an eye on a process that doesn't need an eye? Right there, right?
So let me ask you about that. So this narrowing, this kind of furrowing of the brow and narrowing, that comes when you focus on, let's say, the breath a little bit more intently, or thought or something. You're choosing one little kind of pinpointed object or experience.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't say exactly there, because I'm not doing a lot of concentration practice that would particularly evoke that. So I'm talking about in a very subtle way, because I don't feel like I ever get that furrowed brow. Of course, it's just there's a little bit of, the eyes will come in, and it feels like it's a focus towards content rather than context.
Okay, so let's stay with this part for just a second, because I need to know a little bit more. What is the object of observation, or examples of what could be the object of observations?
Yeah, it usually has to do with some thought stream, some kind of notions of who I am, how I'm being, or what I need to do. And so there's an identification with that thought of, like, oh, I need to be working on this today, or oh, I wish I wouldn't have said that thing, which was really not very conscious, or whatever. They're
and
pieces
these are thoughts that come up in the meditation, or that you bring with you.
Yes, the things. Yeah. Things from my day that I bring. So I would say unfinished business, kind of, shadow stuff that's psychologically unresolved material that's kind of working through as processing, and then that creates some hook. And then it's like, oh, okay, then I'm kind of caught in that. And so,
okay, and if, what would you call that? I'm just if you were to give it a word. Selfing, or, I mean, it doesn't really matter. Thinking, ruminating.
Mm-hmm.
planning.
Yeah, yeah. Planning, ruminating would be good.
Okay, so let's take the word ruminate, because ruminating is about the past, planning is about the future. It could be either one, but let's take, for example, ruminate. So you notice that there's a narrowing of the focus, if that's fair to say. Whatever you described, I felt a little bit of a self-contraction around something. Now, and let's call that ruminating. For example, are you mindful of the ruminating? Like, do you take the rumination or planning or whatever it might be as an object of observation?
As soon as I catch it,
Mm-hmm.
then it becomes an object.
Okay.
But this is the place where often I'm caught in it for long enough and I'm not observing and I'm in it. And then there's that moment of becoming aware and noticing. It's like, oh,
Yeah, that's
that's
the moment I'm
ruminating.
asking
So
about.
yeah, that's the interesting
Okay,
moment.
so as you say, oh, that's ruminating or whatever it might be, and you're detached and you're able to observe
Mm-hmm.
it, even though it's extremely subtle in what we're talking about. What are the qualities, for example, of rumination, physical, mental qualities that arise in that moment that you may become aware? I know we're kind of creating a scenario here, but for example.
What I notice right now as I tune into that is sort of a collapse kind of in the front of my chest and abdomen. There's a bit of a tightening and a contraction.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the rumination would be about remorse or guilt or something
Mm-hmm.
that I've violated my own ethical standards of how
Sure.
I want to be, and
Sure.
then I feel bad about that, and in that there's a bit of a contraction in the belly, a little bit of a sinking in the chest.
And is
And
this kind of sinking chest contraction, is it pleasant or unpleasant?
be unpleasant.
And would you say, is there any preference for it to be different? Aversion towards it?
Interesting. Yeah, there is some aversion towards that. There's an imagining that I should be
Open,
more
expanded, whatever.
expansive, open and
Yeah, yeah,
expansive.
sure.
So there is a subtle resistance to it. Yeah. And
Yeah, so
that's
it sounds like you've got this, you've practiced enough to where you can open up and expanding and all that changes. It changes your physical mental state, which is fine. But what I want to know is if you were to observe, so let's say you have for example, ruminating, and it creates a little bit of contraction, heaviness here in the chest, stomach area. It's slightly unpleasant on a very subtle level. And there's also a very subtle level of aversion towards it. Do you take the aversion as an object of meditation?
No, I haven't. I'm smiling because you're pointing to something this is good for me to recognize right now, that in that aversion. And there's a way that I could be using the expansiveness as an avoidance. That
That's the point.
I have a aversion to this state, so I'm going to pose the opposite state from a conceptual place of like, be expansive. So I'm going to do that, but then I don't really stay present with that state that has.
And I think the expansive state is authentic. I think you actually shift into a deep and expansive state. So that's good. But that's we're looking at the definition of the bypass right now. We're using that state to avoid some really subtle, something very, very subtle. If we just look back just a little bit of theory about Vipassana, as you develop into the stages of awakening, certain defilements of the mind become uprooted. And for desire and aversion to become uprooted, it's a very advanced level of awakening. And it's very rare among humanity to have completely free of desire and aversion. But what happens through these successive awakenings is that the desire and the aversion become reduced, significantly reduced, even cut in. They say cut in half, which is kind of an arbitrary number, but it gets reduced and cut in half. If we use that as our practice, and remember, the purification happens by being not active, not passive, but completely present in that beautiful middle way, whether it's mindfulness or presence, but with being with whatever's arising, and then it will self-liberate. So as we kind of, as we go a little bit into, almost like we're reverse engineering what's at the bottom of what was happening there, ruminating, which was already subtle, we discovered that that was kind of on the surface of something that was deeper and then deeper and then deeper. And it's just what the sense of self does. The sense of self moves towards pleasure, away from pleasantness, away from unpleasantness, whether it's physical or mental. And when it's neutral, the sense of self tends to kind of, be a little bit cloudy around it. Delusion, there's greed, hatred, and delusion. And those are based on, when it's pleasant, we have greed. When it's unpleasant, we have kind of dislike. And when it's neutral, we tend to kind of be delusional about it. So that the basic thing that we always ask is like, what is it? In this case, we kind of went down to the aversion. What are its qualities? You talked about the contraction, etc., unpleasantness. And then what happens to it? That's the key. That's the continuation of that process. What happens to it as you continue to be mindful, as you continue to be with it mindfully? Because it will not stay the same. It'll either become more intense and unpleasant in that case, or less intense, but eventually it will disappear. It will go back to where it came from, which was nowhere, out of the emptiness into something, manifestation. And we want to be with that whole process. Now, if you manage to do that, what you'll find is when you go through that, you'll probably open up into this expanse. It's like a doorway to this expansive place. It could take you into more kind of deeper, if I just speak in Vipassana terms, it could take you a little bit more into dukkha, actually seeing dukkha, but from a place of wisdom, not from that struggle. You're actually seeing the deeper levels of reality more. It's almost like as we start to uncover the empty foundation of the self, we're really resting on nothing. Yeah, Vipassana is Zen, it's all the same. When you get down to it, there's nothing there. That can be a shock to the sense of self. So that can actually be quite a dukkha process, a difficult process to go through, but that type of dukkha is considered wisdom because we're seeing the true nature of reality. Whereas when I'm struggling with, I had an argument with my wife, or I'm this and that, or, I don't want to, money and this, I'm just whatever the stuff is we struggle with, that's usually coming from ignorance. But when it comes from insight, and there was rumination, and there was some contraction, and there was unpleasantness, and there was aversion, and when you start to see that, now we're starting to see the roots of what's really going on. But our normal relationship to that is to turn away, to have some type of aversion for it. So it's the same practice for highly interesting and pleasant experiences like joy and bliss and tranquility and expansiveness. Observe it, take that kind of neither active or passive, but be with it. And then when that cycles around to dukkha, which it will, to also to kind of detach and observe, and to be able to be with that as well. And just seeing the, excuse me, I'm getting over a kind of a cold, a virus. To be with it in the flow of its process.
Watching how this is arising now too in real time as we're here, and I feel more sensitized in this moment to notice, how do I show up right now where there's some degree of relaxation from knowing you, and you make it comfortable to be here, but there's that little bit of like, oh, I'm being recorded in this, and I'm wanna, there's that kind of part that wants to show up, and I'm like noticing my hands here that are folded on the desk, and I've got one hand kind of squeezing the fingers a little bit, and it's like, okay, can I just notice that there's a subtle level of nervousness there, and it's like, okay, not to be avoiding that, thinking I need to be in a bit different place than I am. It's like, oh, and there's a little bit of a contraction in the belly, and it's like, okay, that's here. And I feel like I'm more willing to meet that right now, and the invitation that's being extended to me, what you're saying, rather than the avoidance of thinking, oh, I need to, and then that bypass move, that's really good for me to be aware of how much I'm kind of using that expansive place to get out. There's times that it feels like it authentically arises, that it's just there.
Absolutely.
But
I'm
then there's
sure.
also times that it's an avoidance move, it's a spiritual bypass. And I want to, yeah, watch that and be more curious about it too, without the judgment or thinking I need to show up differently so that, whatever.
Well, I mean, first, I appreciate everything you said. I mean, there's something about this kind of, again, I'll speak a little bit integral, which you also know. There's something about the ability to be with another person while at the same time somehow self-regulating, having an awareness of what's going on in our system for yourself, and for me to do it with myself. But then when we're able to kind of come together, I know Diane works on this a lot. I work on this a lot. Thomas focuses on this a lot, to be able to kind of be with the other person at the same time that you're with yourself. It's a tremendous skill that is I think it's growing in the world, but it's also rare. So first, I appreciate that we can meet this way. And everything that you said about, all your selfing stuff that was going on. I have my selfing stuff going on as well, because it's a recording and it's partly teaching, but I don't feel like I'm want to teach you, but I'm kind of teaching for the video, and all that stuff is happening as well. But what I would say about your, what's clear about your expanded state is that you've developed the ability to access that rather readily. So your access is there. Ken Wilber says that stages are earned, states are kind of given. You can do some drugs and have some pretty far out states, or you can have an intense experience and have some pretty far out states. But stages also have to be earned. So this ability to kind of have this expansive, open, that's something that the access was earned. So, and that's something you won't lose. And if you stop meditating, the ability to do it will go down, will diminish a little bit, but a little bit more meditation, you won't lose that. So I think in terms of like a something to explore, maybe investigate a little bit with your practice, that you've got, and you'll always be able to have it. I would say anytime, if a practice is just, if you're having an intense day or whatever, then just shift into that openness. Yeah? Otherwise, from time to time, see if when you start to feel that happening. Now, sometimes that's a closed loop, and we really get stuck there. So some metta and some loving kindness and some compassion and forgiveness and acceptance and expansiveness is really what's needed, absolutely, to counterbalance it. But sometimes see if you can stay with it in a way, and to the point where you actually kind of religio, you link back to what's really, what's driving the motivation. And at your level of introspection, I think you can, if you just are able to kind of sit back and feel, okay, well, what's that? And if I stay with it, the little qualities will begin to appear. And those little qualities actually might be the tips of the root of what's really driving things. And if you can stay with that, it'll take you into a deeper place. And that will punch you through to something that opens up into, I think that you'll even see into a deeper states in more of a fractal experience. So one that goes really inward, but but it's like going outward into the universe, but it takes you deep into where there's really no end. It's endless, which also at a certain point has its expansiveness. It's like the old, I think it was Jesus or somebody said, no sooner could a camel go through the eye of a needle than a rich man goes to heaven, or whatever the saying was. The ego can't fit through certain passages. It just won't go. So, but if you just stay there with it, if you're able to, let's say, I don't know, some experience comes up and it's, well, I don't know what that is, but I can just be with it. Be with it, then what will happen is it will absorb you into it. Rather than you trying to penetrate it, that never works. It will absorb into, and then you'll find yourself in another almost another realm, but it's actually just a shift in states. And I think it will be, it'll be different in the expanded state, but at the same time, it'll be incredibly similar. Like on a level of deep principles, you'll see the similarity to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like that distinction between trying to penetrate into that state versus being absorbed into it, because I think there's, again, that efforting thing of like, oh, trying to enter that, and what it is to
Yeah.
be absorbed in, and also the the expanding out, but also being absorbed in infinity in the other direction, so to speak. I mean, there's kind of the
Right.
association of infinity is getting wider, but there's
Yeah.
also
Yeah. Yeah.
infinity going deeper. And I have had those kinds of experiences before in my
Mhm.
meditation, where I feel like I get smaller and smaller. It's like, going in that direction to where
Mm.
it feels, and that's where I'd use deep maybe as a metaphor. It's just going
Yeah.
deeper
Yeah.
into
Yeah. Totally.
one thing of absorption.
And like if I just talk about like the progressive insight, which is basically there's a blueprint to consciousness, and different methodologies you'll experience the unfolding differently. But the unfolding, again, looking back, there's a logic to it, and it's the same for everybody. Excuse me. And in the progressive insight, in the progression of this unfolding, there are some times where the mind can be so pinpointed and just with a speck of dust can be with it and nothing disturbs. There's other times, and that's natural. It happens naturally, not through effort. But the conditions have to be right for that to arise. And there's other times where the mind naturally, by itself, opens up in a more panoramic awareness. But again, the conditions arise when that happens. It happens quite naturally over certain stages of the progression of insight. Once you've traversed that progression, you've kind of earned those stages, then there's ways to develop and practice to where you can hone in on a certain bandwidth. It takes a lot of practice, but you can actually learn to do that. Excuse me. And that sounds like that's something that you've already developed. There's a certain bandwidth that you've got to that is expansive but deep. It's not a superficial expansiveness. And so what I would recommend is feel, where does the meditation want to go in that moment? Because sometimes what feels like to the yogi, what feels like regress is actually progress. So for example, sometimes the mindfulness falls apart, the concept, everything falls apart. You think, oh my God, I can't even focus on my breath for 2 seconds. But that's actually a progressive stage of dissolution. That's, even the mindfulness is impermanent. Even the concentration is impermanent. So that can be, for example, I'm not saying that that's going to happen now, but that happens at very specific stages. So sometimes what looks like regress, what feels like is probably better, feels like regress for the ego, for the sense of self, is actually progress. And other times what feels like progress for the sense of self is actually, I wouldn't say regress, but it's a little bit of a stagnation. Kind of like we go back to what that feel good place becomes a little bit of a comfort zone. So, and having regular guidance, that's one way to kind of work through that stuff. But if you don't have that, then just ask, where does the practice want to go? Where is the practice going right now? And usually, at some point it's going to turn into here, to this sense of agency. Really, really subtle contraction that's in there, like with a little joystick trying to, direct the direction of the practice. And if you can just take, oh, wait, there's an agent there. And if you can detach from observe, at a certain point, that will just dissolve. And then the practice unfolds the way it wants to unfold, quite naturally.
Yeah. Lovely instructions.
Yeah, and at this point, I think all meditation, all methodology is the same. It's really, like, you rest with the amount of mindfulness and stability of mind and depth that you have. And then the self-contraction will come up in one way or another. It could be 100,000 different ways, but it's all self-contraction. And if we can just turn to that self-contraction, again, the conditions have to be right. We can't make this happen. But if we can just turn to that self-contraction, then it will self-liberate. It will dissolve. It will go into dissolution.
Yeah.
It's the rather progressed phase of the practice. but I don't think that's something, I think that actually that's something you can, from the sounds of it, something that you can fine tune into.
Yeah. I think one of the takeaways for me here is turning towards those things where I might have a tendency to avoid and skip out into some, because it's there's a way that I and this is just a thought stream that wow, I've been meditating all these years and look at how I'm still not able to do this or whatever. There's a judgment thing that
Sure.
Gets in there, and then I sort of game the system, so to speak, of like, oh, how to get this, wide, expansive state, but it's not really authentic. I mean, I've had that taste, so I know it, but then there's times when it's not quite, deserved in the moment, but I'm just trying to skip over something to get there, because I imagine at this stage of the game, I should be there more continually than I am. But I think to come back and just be with, oh, what is here right now, what's true, and allow it. If it self-liberates, but to be with it and not trying to have it be something different than what it is.
Beautiful. And what you described is something that everybody has, and certainly beginners, but even advanced meditators, is a subtle expectation of how things should somehow. We have a notion of the way that, or experience that we want to go back to, but there's a subtle expectation. And then it's the same practice. Can I just take the subtle expectation? Can I detach and observe? Can I disidentify from the subtle expectation? That's a dualistic thing, yeah. But the moment it liberates, it's back. If you're doing more of a presencing practice, if the subtle expectation is there, it's already dualistic. There's already a sense of self somewhere in the back with a joystick. So use the dualistic practice of mindfulness, detach and observe it as it self-liberates. As it dissolves and self-liberates, it'll open back up into that expansive field. Or if you want to do more of a mindfulness-based meditation, like a Vipassana meditation, then go back and observe the breath for a while. There's nothing like mindful observation of the breath or the body, like you said, to anchor yourself in the present moment. And then, it's just like in many Buddhist schools, they use Vipassana and Samatha. They use mindfulness and concentration as a coupling practice. You can also use a dualistic method, like mindfulness, dualistic. And again, I'm just going to say this for the recording. I call mindfulness dualistic because there's a part of the mind that is mindful of, it's a function of consciousness. It's mindful of things arising in the consciousness. So it's dualistic. Or you can do more of a big mind, open, expansive practice, which is a non-dual practice. And those can be coupled. Those can be coupled. For them to be coupled, your mindfulness has to get to that place where it's the pure observer, which is a so subtle agency. But then if you can just turn on that, or turn on the wrong way, but if you can take that as an object, then it kind of liberates as well into this kind of expansiveness and big, excuse me, a big mind. It's great to hear about your practice, Eric.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this has been incredibly valuable to me. I mean, I really haven't explored quite in this way before. I mean, it's been a while since I've had retreats where I'll do the interview with the teacher or something. I mean, it's been a couple of years since I've had that specifically, but I really appreciate what it is you're doing in this. It's very insightful for this time.
Well, maybe I'll just kind of show honor and respect to my teacher, Sadhu Pandita and Sayadaw Vivekananda. It was really two, but it was really Vivekananda that I worked more in depth with. And that was the method. We get daily interviews, just short 15-minute interviews, just a phenomenological report of what's going on. And he would do this with me, and it was amazing. And then after some pretty intense Vipassana meditation, I moved into more non-dual practices. I shouldn't say I augmented, expanded my practice into, similar to you actually, into more, I wouldn't say Zen per se, but more big mind and more non-dual practices and evolutionary practices. And I think that the combination is golden, and because sometimes we're one way and other times we're another way, and in the end they're both They're both complete states. They're both absolute in that sense. Whether it's with the pure observer, or whether, or if the observer manages to collapse somehow. And they're just gems. There's a treasure for humanity. Sacred tradition for humanity, which is rare. That's why it's nice to be able to. It's so nice to be able to create sangha through technology in a way.
Yeah, thank you. I'm feeling a warmth and tenderness in my heart right now as I appreciate practice lineages and the intense practice of all these beings over the course of thousands of years to develop these systems that we're working with, and that we're gaining the benefits of all of that. Deep intensive practice that all those folks did. So feeling gratitude for that.
And it's alive and well. It's still a minority of humanity, but you and I can find it. If not in person, if not in the little area that we live in, the local area, we can connect online and excuse me. And then, it's a gift. We are very privileged to be able to do that.
Yeah. And thank you too, Miles, for your practice over all this time.
Yeah, you're
what
welcome.
That brings, and feeling the grace of that, and just very grateful right now.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think you and I have probably met about 6 times in this context, only online, and it's always been very rich and deep. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording, but maybe we just stick for a little moment after that. So this recording I'll probably post it in about a week's time. So if you want to review it, it'll be on the blog, but I'll put it up on YouTube probably in about 24 hours. So.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you.